So in this video, I will show you how to paint a realistic eye using an airbrush. On the side of the screen, you can see a list of tools that I use. So to begin with, I start off with a drawing, and then I used masking fluid to preserve the highlights and the whites of the eye, and that is the yellow markings that you see dotted around in the illustration. And then I've traced the drawing on a separate piece of paper, and I used a knife, X-Acto knife, to cut out a stencil, a paper stencil, and that's the cutout that you see pop up in my hand ever so often. So you can see I'm using it there to frame the inner corners of the eye. I'm not using anything special. I'm just using scrap pieces of paper, printer paper. And what I'm doing is I'm sort of mapping out these shadow areas where the darker values are, and I'm just constantly comparing that to my reference. So I can see my reference that the right side of the eye has the darkest value, so I'm starting off there because it's a good reference point for me in order to create a contrast for the rest of the painting. So I'm using a mixture of freehand techniques and paper stencils. So I'm using the freehand to kind of create soft cast shadow areas under the eyelids. They're really good for eyelashes as well, if you want to create like nice feathery soft techniques. But I'm using the paper stencil mainly to just frame the eye, the irises, and also to prevent overspray when I don't want, I don't want paint on certain areas when I'm not ready to paint yet. So I'm just using the paper stencil for that as well. And at this point, I'm thinking of the form and shape. I go in depth in that in my previous video on how to paint a nose. So I've put a little reference here in the corner. The eye is sort of like an oval, a sphere. So I'm thinking of that while I'm painting because I want to simplify the complex forms first, so I have a better idea, a general idea on how the form is turning, how it looks three-dimensional. So in my head, an eye is more of a circle, more of a sphere. So I want to kind of paint round, think of rounded shapes and how the shadow areas are forming round the eyeball, the socket. And that kind of gives me more of a grounded view on how I want to approach the painting. So this is a good example of the paper stencil that I'm using around the iris. So I've initially started off by just framing the outer edges, the periphery of the iris there. And then I'm doing the same thing again with the pupil, just framing that outer corner. And then I'm going to go in with some freehand techniques. So at this stage, I am focusing on the texture and the details of the iris. So I'm trying to mimic all those fine details that you see in the eyes when you zoom into a person's face. So I started off with the pupil because it's really simple, and again, it's a good reference point for me in terms of value because the pupils tend to be the darkest point in the eyes. And then I'm using freehand techniques to sort of soften out the outer edges because I don't want it to be too sharp. You don't have a bold outline around your eye that looks too cartoonish. So you want to soften your techniques, soften your edges most of the time when you're trying to paint realism, because oftentimes things aren't that sharp as they appear to be. And here is a technique that I'm using that I will continue to use throughout the painting process. And for airbrush artists, we refer to this as dagger strokes. So it's like a technique that we use when we want to create tapered lines or lines with a thinner point at the end. And it's a bit difficult to explain, but essentially while you pull the trigger back for paint, you subtly push your hands closer to the surface, and those dual actions will create a tapered line while you're doing it. And it's something that requires a lot of practice, and I'm not perfect at it at all. So you will see me switch between different tools in order to achieve the same look. So here again, I'm using the paper stencil to kind of, when I want sharper textures, I'll add that in, and then I'll soften those out with an airbrush. So here you see me using a pencil eraser. What I'm doing is I'm rubbing out the masking fluid that I had at the beginning, and that's revealing the highlights and the bright textures that I want in the iris. And then I'm using a white pencil to further create more texture and also kind of give me more control that I was lacking with my airbrush dagger strokes. So the white pencil is really good for that, and I do use that quite a lot when it comes to painting in color as well. Another handy tip with the pencil is, because I'm using paper which is not really ideal for erasing, a lot of airbrush artists will use surfaces like Yupo paper. They will use dye bond aluminium panels. These are surfaces that are really good for erasing techniques, but paper is not one of them because it's too absorbent. So to make up for that, I will use a white pencil, or I'll use white ink to achieve a similar result. And throughout this stage of painting the iris, I'm going back and forth, layering, creating more texture, and also upping up the contrast, going over the same areas to make them darker. I'm using transparent black ink, and I've diluted it with water, so it's not really black at the very beginning. It takes me time to get to that really dark value, so I have to constantly layer and layer and layer, but I prefer that way because it gives me more control and more flexibility. So I have jumped a little bit here with the iris, but I was just repeating the same steps that I was doing on the right hand side, so I literally flipped that on the left hand side. And here I am focusing on the under eyelid eyelashes area. I'm mostly using freehand techniques because I want it to be quite soft but bold. And I'm layering, boosting the contrast, making it deeper and more saturated. So these are the dagger strokes that I was referring to in the iris, but this is a better example of how I'm doing them. I've sped the video up so it looks like I'm going really fast, but I'm actually taking my time. They are quite difficult to do. It requires a lot of focus, but they're really good for things like painting the eyelashes, painting fine lines, painting hair, fur, little tiny stitching on fabric. They're really good, so I would employ anyone to practice doing those because it will be beneficial in the long run. And you can see me doing that same technique for the eyelashes at the bottom of the eyes as well. The thinner or smaller the airbrush, should say, the smaller the airbrush needle that you have, the easier it will be to do those fine lines and dagger strokes. but I'm using a Iwata Eclipse. It's a 0.3, so it's sort of a medium. And that concludes the video. This is a still image of the final result. I do hope you enjoyed the video and you found it useful and took away some helpful tips and techniques. If you want to help me out further, please give this video a like, a follow. I'll greatly appreciate it, and it'll encourage me to do more videos like this in the future.